Have you ever wondered why a nation, once an enemy in war, would one day place its most powerful ships in the hands of the very people it once fought against? It sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? Japan, the country that once rained fire upon the Philippines during the darkest years of the Second World War, is now delivering 6 warships to the very nation it once occupied. 6 gleaming, modern vessels, built with the precision of Japanese engineering, now sailing under the Philippine flag. What makes this gesture even more surprising is that it is not wrapped in simple charity or ordinary diplomacy. It carries with it a story of pain, forgiveness, resilience, and perhaps a hidden motive that few truly understand. Picture for a moment a quiet morning at the naval base in Subic. The sun is rising over the Zambales Mountains. The waters shimmer with a soft orange glow, and on the horizon silhouettes begin to appear. At first, they look like shadows, but as they draw closer, they transform into towering gray vessels, their decks alive with Japanese crew in crisp white uniforms. A Filipino officer stands at the pier, silent, his chest tightening. His grandfather once told him stories of Japanese warships too, but back then they came as invaders, bringing fear and loss. And now, decades later, here they were again. But this time the Japanese ships carried not bombs, but promises. It was a moment that made many Filipinos stop and ask themselves, why now? Why would Japan give away something so valuable, something that symbolizes both pride and power? Warships are not like textbooks or relief goods. They are instruments of defense, of sovereignty, of strength. For Japan to part with them, especially to the Philippines, means that something deeper is at play. Some saw it as an act of friendship, a proof of reconciliation between two nations once scarred by blood. Others, more cautious, whispered about strategy, about secret agendas hidden beneath the polite smiles of diplomats. After all, in the world of geopolitics, nothing is ever purely free. For a young naval lieutenant named Marco, that day at Subic would never leave his memory. He was only 35, but he carried with him the weight of his family's history. His grandfather, a farmer in Pampanga, had been a boy when Japanese troops marched into their town during the war. The stories Marco heard growing up were filled with images of suffering. Men dragged from their homes, women hiding in fear, children running barefoot into the sugarcane fields. And yet, his grandfather never spoke with bitterness. He would only say, "Time has its way of healing, but it also has its way of teaching." Those words echoed in Marco's mind as he stood watching the Japanese flag slowly lower, replaced by the Philippine sun and stars on the mast of one of the ships. The crowd cheered, but Marco felt conflicted. Was this truly a gift? Or was it a reminder that the Philippines, even in modern times, remains caught in the middle of forces far larger than itself? In the distance, beyond the horizon, another nation was rising with unmatched power, China. And China's growing presence in the West Philippine Sea had already pushed Filipino fishermen out of their own waters, already built artificial islands bristling with military bases. Could it be that these ships from Japan were not just about friendship, but about preparing the Philippines for a role it never asked for? A role as a small but crucial player in a much larger struggle between giants. And yet, there was something undeniably moving about the ceremony. Filipino sailors stepped onto the decks of their new ships with tears in their eyes, proud to stand tall in crisp uniforms, proud to know their nation was not entirely alone. For many, the gesture from Japan felt like a sign of respect, a recognition that the Philippines mattered, that its struggles were seen. It was hard to forget how small the country often felt in the eyes of the world, a nation underestimated, sometimes ignored. But here was Japan, once a conqueror, now handing over warships as if to say, "We trust you. We stand with you." Still, behind every public display lies a private story. Diplomats spoke of mutual security cooperation, of shared values, and regional stability. But what does that truly mean for ordinary Filipinos? For the fisherman in Zambales who just wants to cast his net without fear of being chased by foreign patrol boats? For the mother in Mindoro who prays that her son in the Navy returns home, safe from his duty at sea? For people like Marco, who wonder if they are inheriting protection, or a burden that could one day pull the Philippines into conflicts not of its own choosing? This is where the story truly begins. Because those 6 warships are more than steel and engines. They are symbols of an unexpected friendship, of wounds not fully healed, of trust being tested on stormy waters. They are also warnings, perhaps, of battles yet to come. And in the heart of it all are the Filipinos, people who have always stood resilient in the face of forces far greater than themselves. Marco would later recall how, as the Japanese commander shook his hand that morning, he felt something unusual. The grip was firm, but almost trembling, as if the officer too carried the ghosts of history in his touch. And when he leaned in and whispered, "Take care of her," referring to the ship that now bore the Philippine flag, Marco realized this was not just about ships. It was about responsibility, about trust, about preparing for storms on the horizon that no single nation could face alone. And so the question lingers. Was this a true gift of friendship? A bridge built over the ruins of war? Or was it a subtle move on a chessboard where the Philippines is not a player but a piece? That question would haunt Marco long after the ceremony ended, and it would not be answered easily because the truth lay not just in history, but in the uncertain future of the seas that have always defined the destiny of the Philippines. That night, after the ceremony in Subic, Marco couldn't sleep. The echo of footsteps on steel decks, the cheers of the crowd, the sight of the Japanese officers saluting, it all kept replaying in his head. He wandered along the quiet pier, staring at the warships now lined up like guardians of the bay. Their hulls glistened under the moonlight, massive and silent, as if holding secrets too heavy to share. He thought of his grandfather again, the old man who had survived the cruelty of war, but somehow found forgiveness in his heart. Marco remembered sitting beside him in the Naipa hut years ago, listening to stories while the cicadas hummed outside. "The Japanese were our enemies," his grandfather once said softly. "But they were also human. Remember that, Apo. Never forget the pain, but never close your heart to peace either." Those words weighed on Marco now, because standing before him was proof that yesterday's enemies could become today's allies. And yet, there was something unsettling about the speed of it all. The Philippines had been pleading for help in protecting its waters for years. Suddenly, Japan, of all countries, was stepping in with ships, training, and promises. Why now? Why with such urgency? The answer, Marco suspected, lay not in the past, but in the present. On his phone, he opened a news report about Chinese patrols spotted near Pagasa Island again. Fishermen were being driven away once more, their boats dwarfed by massive steel hulls painted with foreign flags. Marco could almost hear the frustration in their voices. Ordinary men, whose only dream was to bring home fish for their families, forced to turn back because their own seas had been claimed by someone else. That was the true battlefield, Marco realized. Not just warships and missiles, but dignity. The Philippines was not rich in weaponry. Its navy was small, its air force modest, its soldiers brave but under-equipped. And yet here was Japan, a nation that had once unleashed war across Asia, now rearming not with conquest but with alliances. The ships, Marco thought, were not simply donations. They were statements. Statements to China, to the world, and perhaps even to Filipinos themselves. But this stirred another question in Marco's heart. Could this be a second chance for the Philippines? Or was it simply another chapter of dependency? Another reminder that the country could not stand on its own without leaning on bigger powers? It was a question as old as Philippine history itself. Caught between empires, from Spain to America to Japan, and now balancing between new giants rising in the region. Marco found himself walking along the deck of one of the newly transferred ships. The smell of paint still clung to the rails. The hum of machinery vibrated beneath his feet. He placed his hand on the steel and whispered almost to himself, "Are you really ours?" He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the ship or to something deeper, the future of his nation. The next day, he met with Captain Rosario, an older officer who had served nearly 3 decades in the Navy. Over coffee in the mess hall, Marco asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Sir, why do you think Japan is doing this? Is it just friendship, or something more?" The captain looked at him for a long time before answering. His voice was calm, almost fatherly. "Marco, the world is changing faster than most people realize. Japan is not just giving us ships. They're making a statement. They know China is rising. They know America is distracted. And they know the Philippines is sitting at the heart of the sea lanes that keep Asia alive. Whoever controls these waters controls the future. That's why we are not forgotten. That's why they need us." Marco sat in silence, letting the words sink in. He thought of the fishermen again, of the families who lived by the sea. He thought of his grandfather's scars. And suddenly, the gift of 6 warships did not feel simple at all. It felt heavy, almost like an inheritance of responsibility. Yet amidst the politics and strategy, there was still something deeply human in it. Marco remembered how the Japanese commander shook his hand and whispered, "Take care of her." That wasn't just a political line. It was a plea from one man to another, from one navy to another, perhaps even from one generation to another. Maybe, Marco thought, this was not only about agendas. Maybe it was also about redemption, because Japan, too, carried its ghosts. For decades, the memory of its wartime aggression had lingered like a shadow. Perhaps giving these ships was a way of saying, "We are no longer that nation. We are not your enemy anymore. We want to help." Marco wondered if he could believe that. Could forgiveness truly anchor peace? Could trust grow stronger than the bitterness of history? As he looked out again at the horizon, the water stretched endlessly before him, a reminder of both beauty and danger. Somewhere out there, unseen in the night, Chinese vessels prowled, asserting dominance. Somewhere beyond, American carriers sailed, watching. And here in Subic, Japanese ships now bore the Philippine flag. For Marco, it felt like the Philippines was standing on the edge of something far greater than itself. The warships might defend the nation, but they could also pull it into battles it had not chosen. Yet in that tension lay the true essence of being Filipino, always resilient, always navigating storms, always finding a way to survive between the waves of stronger powers. And as he stood in silence, he realized that the real question was not whether Japan had a secret agenda. The real question was whether the Philippines was ready to step into the role destiny was thrusting upon it. The ships were here. The sea was waiting, and the future was already calling. The weeks after the handover passed quickly, and Marco began training his crew on their new vessel. Every day, he walked the deck with pride, but also with an unease that never seemed to leave his chest. The warship was sleek, efficient, every button and dial meticulously designed. It was far more advanced than the older vessels the Philippine Navy had relied on for years. And yet, the more Marco studied the ship, the more he realized it was not just a gift. It was a responsibility that could change lives. The responsibility became real one morning when news broke that Chinese Coast Guard ships had once again blocked Filipino fishermen near Scarborough Shoal. Video clips surfaced online. Small wooden bancas surrounded by massive white ships, their sirens blaring, their water cannons spraying. The fishermen's voices cracked as they shouted that they only wanted to fish in their own seas. Their nets were empty, their faces filled with defeat. For Marco, watching those images was like a knife to the heart. These were not just strangers. They were his countrymen, people whose dignity was being stripped away in broad daylight. In the barracks, the sailors debated heatedly. Some felt grateful for Japan's support. Others worried about becoming pawns in a bigger conflict. One young seaman asked bluntly, "Sir, what if we're just being used? What if this is not about us at all, but about Japan and China fighting their own battle?" Marco didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, at the faces of men barely in their 20s, faces that carried both fear and courage. He thought of his grandfather again, of forgiveness, of survival. Finally, he said, "Maybe we are pawns. But even pawns have families to protect. Even pawns have a duty to stand." Still, the thought lingered. Because while the Philippines welcomed Japan's help, it was no secret that America was also watching closely. The old alliance with the United States remained strong, and their bases, aircraft, and submarines were never far from Philippine shores. Some wondered if the warships from Japan were truly about helping the Philippines, or about preparing the country to play a frontline role in the struggle for the South China Sea. Marco felt the weight of history pressing down. His grandfather's generation had endured occupation by Japan. His father's generation had lived under the shadow of American bases. And now, his own generation faced a new kind of battle, one not fought in trenches or fields, but in the gray zones of disputed waters, where fishermen, coast guards, and navies danced dangerously close to war without ever declaring it. One evening, Marco stood alone on the bridge of the ship, watching the horizon fade into night. The sea was calm, but he knew beneath the surface it could turn violent without warning. He thought of the words whispered by the Japanese commander. "Take care of her." The more he repeated those words in his mind, the more he realized they were not only about the ship. They were about the Philippines itself. Fragile, brave, beautiful, but always caught between storms. Later, when he spoke with Captain Rosario again, Marco asked the question that had been gnawing at him. "Sir, do you think we can ever stand on our own? Or will we always depend on others, on Japan, on America, to protect us?" The captain smiled faintly, as if he had carried the same question for years. "Marco, standing on our own is not about having the biggest ships or the strongest weapons. It's about never giving up our spirit. Look at our history. We've been invaded, occupied, underestimated. And yet we are still here. That is our strength. These ships," he gestured towards the pier, "they help. But what matters is the people on them. You, your crew, your countrymen. That is what makes a navy. That is what makes a nation." The words stirred something in Marco. For the first time, he saw the ships not as burdens or symbols of dependency, but as tools, a chance for Filipinos to stand taller, even if the world doubted them. Perhaps the question was not about whether Japan had a secret agenda. Perhaps the real question was whether the Philippines could transform every challenge, every so-called hand-me-down, into a stepping stone for true independence. Still, the uncertainty of the future loomed. The South China Sea remained tense. American and Chinese warships shadowed each other in the open waters. Japan's role in the region grew bolder, and with every move, the Philippines found itself standing at a crossroads. Marco felt it deep in his bones, that his generation would be tested in ways he could not yet see. That night, before heading to his quarters, Marco stood once more at the bow of the ship. The wind carried the scent of salt and freedom, but also of danger. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for wisdom. Wisdom to know when to fight, when to forgive, and when to stand firm without fear. The warships were here. The seas were restless. And for Marco, the story was only beginning. The storm came sooner than anyone expected. One dawn, the alarm bells rang across the base. Chinese vessels had entered waters claimed by the Philippines, this time much closer than before. Reports flooded in of Filipino fishermen being forced to abandon their nets, their outraged voices carried across radios and cell phone recordings. The tension that had been simmering for months finally felt like it was about to boil over. Marco was on duty when the call came. His ship, one of the 6 recently transferred from Japan, was ordered to patrol near the contested waters. His crew scrambled to their stations, hearts pounding, the air thick with both fear and pride. For many of them, it was the first time they would face foreign vessels in a real confrontation. Marco walked the deck calmly, though inside he felt the same weight pressing on him that his grandfather must have felt decades ago when Japanese soldiers entered their town. History had come full circle. Only this time, Marco was not hiding in the fields. He was standing on the deck of a warship, the Philippine flag above him, his country's dignity in his hands. As they approached the area, the horizon grew crowded with gray shapes. Massive Chinese Coast Guard ships, their loudspeakers blaring, dwarfed the Filipino vessel. The men on board looked up at them in awe and terror. Marco gripped the rail and whispered to himself, "Not invaders this time. Not anymore. We are here to stand." The standoff lasted hours. Words were exchanged through radios, orders barked from Beijing, responses sent from Manila. And while no shots were fired, the silence between each warning felt like thunder rolling in the distance. For Marco and his crew, it was a test of nerve, of discipline, of what it meant to defend a nation that too often felt defenseless. They were underdogs. Yes, but they were underdogs who refused to bow. That night, after they returned to port, Marco could hardly sleep. His men were exhausted but proud. They had stood their ground. They had not yielded. In their eyes, Marco saw something he had never seen before. A quiet fire, the birth of belief that the Philippines, no matter how small, could stand in the face of giants. And yet he knew the danger was far from over. The shadow of China loomed larger every day. America's presence brought reassurance, but also risk. Japan's support, though valuable, came with its own unspoken interests. The Philippines was a prize, a key to the sea lanes of Asia, a place no global power could afford to ignore. But to Filipinos, it was more than that. It was home. It was life. It was the place where fishermen prayed for a good catch, where mothers waited for their sons to return, where families gathered in nipa huts and concrete houses alike to share stories of survival and hope. For Marco, the lesson was clear. The 6 warships were not the story. They were symbols. What truly mattered was how the Filipino people would use them, not just to defend water and land, but to remind the world that even the smallest nations carry a strength rooted in faith, in family, in resilience. He thought again of his grandfather's words. Time has its way of healing, but it also has its way of teaching. Perhaps this was the teaching, that history would always place the Philippines between greater powers, that betrayal and help could look alike, and motives would always be mixed. But none of that could erase the spirit of a people who refused to vanish. The next morning, Marco stood before his crew. They looked to him not just as an officer, but as a leader, as someone who carried their unspoken fears and hopes. He told them, "We are not the strongest navy in the world. We are not the richest. But we are Filipinos, and that means we will endure. These ships are not just steel. They are trust, they are sacrifice, They are reminders that we have survived worse, and we will survive this too. If the world underestimates us, let them. Because it has always been in the storms that the Filipino heart shines brightest. The sailors erupted in applause, not because the danger was gone, but because they felt seen. They felt that their struggle mattered. And in that moment, Marco realized that the Philippines' greatest weapon was not in its ships or alliances, but in its people, the ordinary men and women who refused to surrender their seas, their homes, their dignity. As the sun rose over Subic, the warships gleamed once again, no longer just gifts from Japan, but vessels reborn with Filipino pride. Marco looked at them and smiled. The secret agenda, if there was one, no longer mattered as much. What mattered was that the Philippines had found in them an opportunity to stand taller, to claim its place, to show the world that it may be an underdog, but it is an underdog that does not kneel. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the very thing the world needed to see. Because in the end, this was not only the story of ships crossing seas, it was the story of a nation crossing history, transforming pain into strength, doubt into courage, and smallness into resilience. The waves would keep rising, the giants would keep clashing, but the Philippines, with faith in God, love of family, and the unbreakable heart of its people, would always find a way to endure. And as Marco whispered a quiet prayer, he knew his grandfather was right. The storms would teach, the storms would heal, and through it all, the Philippines would never disappear. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this video with family and friends, because the story of the Philippines is not just history, it is our destiny. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the untold stories that reveal who we are as a people and what we are still becoming. And if you believe the Filipino spirit can rise above any storm, leave a comment below with the words, "Mabuhay ang Pilipinas." Together, let's remind the world that we are small, but we are never weak.